Welcome to the INC Transportation Committee meeting for May 13th, 2021. INC is an association of neighborhood associations in Denver, and our committee meetings are open to everyone. There's a lot going on these days in transportation, and we only get a chance to cover a few things in any given meeting. Things that are going on that we're not going to be able to cover today, but I'm sure you're following in the news. Transportation funding at every level, whether it's federal transportation funding, either a new infrastructure bill or pandemic relief related state transportation funding that's rapidly working its way through the legislature and is getting both people who think it's done the right way and not. A lot of work going on there. And then at a local level, funding that may come to the city as part of pandemic relief as well as a potential bond project. So we're going to try to make sense of all these funding sources in a coming meeting. Today, two of the topics are really focused on prioritizing projects. And that's really relevant to upcoming funding because how they're prioritized, how they're shovel ready, to borrow a term from our last recession, will really determine the projects that start up here soon and have results quickly. So keep following all of that. Couple announcements. Denver Streets Partnership will be having their Vision Zero Action Plan scorecard released next week. Keep an eye out for that. They've done that for several years, and it's holding the city to the city's own commitments to making our streets safer. And then on May 19th at 4 p.m., there's the Ride and Walk of Silence, which will, of course, be a little different during the pandemic, but will be a memorial type service at the Civic Center Park. So watch for Denver Streets Partnership announcements about that important event. Micromobility, scooters and bikes share, has been approved by City Council. Their action was to approve the right-of-way permit, and they did so this past Monday night. So we'll be seeing a lot of the specifics that we got a preview of 2 months ago rolling out from the city very soon. This year, we'll be tracking closely 20 is Plenty, trying to drop the default speed limit on local streets to 20 miles per hour. Another initiative being spearheaded by the coalition that is the Denver Streets Partnership, and sidewalks. It's been INC's decades-long push to have better maintained sidewalks throughout the city. And we know, and the auditor knows, and everybody knows, that the way we're doing it right now just doesn't work. It's basically relying on hope that people take care of the sidewalks rather than having an actual program. But for today, we've got 4 topics. We've got an update on the 16th Street Mall, which is about to kick off. We have 2 planning efforts, and it's not just long-term planning. It's taking plans we already have and deciding what's the priority for implementation. This is the bridged implementation, both for everything and then a deeper dive on transit. And we'll end tonight with a look at Front Range Passenger Rail, which is getting more and more real. It'll be great. We'll hear from the chair of the Southwest Chief and Front Range Passenger Rail Commission. We'll start with Travis Bogan and Jason Whitlock. They're here to tell us about the 16th Street Mall, the notice to proceed. So work is about to begin on the 16th Street Mall and what to expect. Travis, I'll let you share your screen and introduce the team.
Excellent. Thank you, Joel. 1 minute here. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, so much. We appreciate the opportunity to present to you tonight with an update on the 16th Street Pedestrian Mall and Transitway Reconstruction Project. We'll be going through quite a bit of material over the next 20 minutes, and so we have reserved some time at the end for Q&A. Just wanted to provide an overview that the 16th Street Pedestrian Mall and Transitway, as you know, is one of the most successful pedestrian malls in the nation. And just some pre-pandemic numbers, the free mall ride shuttle was supporting about almost 40,000 RTD riders daily. It's a resource for downtown workforce, downtown residents, businesses, and tourists. Want to provide some historic photos just to remind us all that while our infrastructure feels permanent, it's always evolving. So you can see the streetcar tracks and the overhead catenary lines. Note the 2-way traffic. Now we're moving into color and 1-way traffic. No more overhead catenary. Now we're starting to evolve into the mall. Note the mall is coming on the bench and people walking in the street. Our construction is going to look considerably different. We are going to provide accessible access throughout the construction limits. Hopefully no one steals the Daniels and Fishers Tower this time. And then opening day, 1982. Really right now that looks awkwardly close considering the last year we've had. Want to transition now into a brief project overview. Our project is a full reconstruction of the original granite paver portion of the mall that extends from Market Street to Broadway. You'll note the bigger dash line includes the overall study limits, but again, our project is Market Street to Broadway. And what we're doing within these limits is fully reconstructing the mall, creating a new realigned and consolidated transit way that'll provide wider ADA accessible walkways and new amenity zones with increased safety and activation opportunities. We're going to replace the existing granite pavement system with a new granite pavement system that has subsurface drainage capability, more robust structural section, and the new pavers will have a more rough surface profile to provide more friction to reduce the potential for slippery surfaces. As you know, when the existing granite gets wet or snowy, it can get pretty slick. There's really important to the project is the public life elements that'll be integrated into the project, and Jason Whitlock will talk a little bit more about that. Throughout this whole project, we are committed to maintaining the historic character of the original design and really leveraging the community vision that's been developed over the last 10 years. I want to give you a quick overview of the project schedule. As Joel mentioned, we issued notice to proceed to PCL constructors on April 6th. So we're a little over a month into approximately 45-month-long project, and it is a design build project. We're initiating the design development that'll last really into fall of 2022. But we are doing some early pre-construction work that'll be starting a little bit later this spring and go into fall, and that'll include our subsurface utility explorations, the potholing, additional surveying, and later towards the end of this year, there may be some early Excel utility relocations for some construction enabling work, and that early work would really primarily be limited to intersections. The real construction, the mobilization for the mall block reconstruction is planned for the summer of next year. And the project will be complete by the end of 2024. Just wanted to give a quick update on the budget. The capital stack for the project is pretty complex. Much of the funding that we have has been in development for years and has clear ties to the mall. We're leveraging a lot of external funding partners, including TIF administered through Dura, some local CIP funds, some voter-approved Elevate funds, local wastewater funds, and then additional state and federal funds. We also have a blended team to help deliver this project, collaborating with a number of city agencies and a robust stakeholder group. We have program management and construction oversight support from consultant partners. And then, of course, we have our design build partner, PCL. Just a little bit of project background. I think I'll transition this over to Jason.
Thank you, Travis. Again, my name is Jason Whitlock. I'm with Community Planning and Development, part of the city, and on our urban design team. As we are and have been looking at the importance of this street, of this really as our city and really our region's main street, the number of people, as Travis was talking about, that live on the mall now. Actually, we're starting to see the number of residential on the upper side of the mall sort of increase, be almost similar to the number of people that are living in Lodo, people that work there, people that come and visit and play. It's been important for us to do a series of studies, a series of engagements with the community throughout the process to understand kind of what the role of the street is, changes. We've been working with the Downtown Denver Partnership and others over a long series of years, and it had a good long sort of set of explorations, investigations open houses, public meetings, events with a partnership called Meet in the Street, we'll talk about in a second, that really actually ask people to come down and vote with your feet to start to use the space, understand what is possible, and what the future can can hold for the mall as it gets redesigned and rethought. What is possible, and it's become really important for us through a long process and a series of studies to actually come to a solution really for everything from the surface of the granite up. It's been important for us to know what the public space and the public life of the mall is, in addition to, I think Travis will talk a little bit more about some of the struggles with the infrastructure and everything below the surface of the granite, but all that substructure helps us be able to talk now with you about the things we're doing on the surface of the granite up. So one of the things as we looked at the mall and kind of studied, looked at other really great streets in the world that were good pedestrian and transit malls, we looked at this and really saw that sort of about every 10 people in the space, only one of those people were like standing, staying, shopping, doing what we're calling more sort of stationary activities. When we look at other places in the world, you start to get sort of 20, 30 some % of the people in the space really being in the space. So we know that it functions really well as a long hallway, but it functions a little less as that living room, as a place in our community to stop, to stand, to have community. And that's important for us. It's really important for street and street life when we look at other great streets in the world. And through this, we worked with the Downtown Denver Partnership, did a series of events called Meet in the Street, where we actually went out there and said, what was possible? What's possible on the 16th Street Mall? Is it possible to rethink the street? If we actually put things out for children, if we put seating out there, if we actually increase the amount of greenery, could that transform the way that people acted in the space, thought of the space, and used the space? And the answer was a resounding yes. It was amazing what we found, the kinds of activations and the kinds of things that we could do within the long length of the mall that really changed the behavior. We counted people and activities, and it was important for us as we look forward to see what's possible and what a future redesign could look like. What we found was that more begets more. The healthier a place is, the more we increase the kinds of uses, the diversity, the amount of staying. It was easier and better to sort of continue to make those invitations. Some things that really let us know that a space is behaving well as urban designers are the number of children that we see in a space. Our most vulnerable user groups are a good indication of how healthy a space is. Also, the relationship of number and proportion of men to women in a space, also really important. And through these activations, through very simple things that we're doing sometimes in these Meet in the Street events, you do so very, very basic things. And people didn't believe that children really were on the mall or lived on the mall. And all of a sudden you do something and out within minutes, within a half an hour, there's a whole collection of children in the space. And it was wonderful and amazing to see. And overall, sort of when we did these invitations, got people to come and stay, we saw sort of almost a 50% increase in the number of people staying in the space that then were there sort of previously. That starts to lead us to an understanding of what a good, healthy street should be and could be, that we see so many other places of the world and want for our main street. Just for this group to know, we're actually, we took a pause from Meet in the Street, but this year we'll also be doing the Meet in the Street events. There are the 4 weekends that we are showing there on the mall. Again, this is the partnership. This is about the street, and it's important as we look to the future to have sort of a flexible and adaptable space, one that is really important for us as a pedestrian and a transit mall, but also that we can change and adapt to have these sort of very stationary events. And so we'll have these Meet in the Street events over the summer. Again, a part of the downtown vibrancy, and would love all of this group to come down to enjoy the space, enjoy the street, and continue to see some of the festivities that happen and are possible in that spot. So essentially, what are we doing? What have we learned? It started to point us to a solution. This is a somewhat typical section that you would see in the sort of the middle blocks of the mall, what were previously where the median was. We're calling this the center running blocks. We're consolidating the two lanes of transit and providing additional space that are sort of right at the building edges. We have an enhanced amenity zone on both sides there. Previously, the trees were kind of in the middle of the space, doing a lot of shading of the buses. The idea that's to pull the trees out, diverse our downtown canopy, the number of species along the mall there, put those trees in amenity zones, widen the amenity zones, and create sort of a good 10-foot clear walkway that is actually can be fairly close to the buildings and the building frontages, to the beverage, food, retail, activities, busters, all of that things that we love to see on the mall. And so it provides us these really good sort of two-sided experiences on both sides of the mall as you walk up and down, and you have some distance between you and the bus divided by that amenity zone. The kinds of things that we're investigating now, the things on the surface of the granite up, those things that will be actually really 90% of what people will be experiencing as a different place on the mall, sort of the vibrancy, additional kinds of seating, better locations for greenery, understanding the importance of planting and greenery as part of our space and our life in this downtown environment. A variety of seating, and we're calling seating postures, the idea that the kinds of seats, the sort of invitations that we make are really important so that people feel like they can make those acquaintances, they can have that coffee, and they can stop within the space. So we're doing a series of studies on the kinds of furniture and furnishings and additional planting that we're going to be putting in the future of the new design mall. And then lastly, the idea that the great streets that we have throughout the country, throughout the world, tend to be shorter than sort of the 1.5 miles of the mall length. They tend to be in these smaller chunks. And so the idea that we're focusing some activity on these key blocks and key character areas, we could have blocks where we're collecting some of these downtown vending kiosks and creating some really good spaces there for us to have in the future.
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to continue on with a little bit of a project update. As I mentioned, we've hired PCL as the design build contractor, and they've assembled a really great team that includes a number of disadvantaged business enterprises to support the project. And we do have a DBE design goal and construction goal on this project. Wanted to just show you a little bit of how the design is progressing. PCL's done LiDAR scanning above ground and taken the due diligence information and the data that we've been able to collect, and we'll supplement it with additional data to build a 3D model below the ground. And just a couple things to point out, these white boxes represent the space where we will plant the trees, and it provides Silvacell enough volume of uncompacted soil that will allow healthy root growth. And really what's neat about this model, you can see right now, is looking up from the ground. We're able to identify and design around potential utility conflicts. We're basically building the project virtually before building it in the field. And doing this really enables, as I mentioned, identification of conflicts and resolution of those before we actually get out with construction equipment. We do have a robust public outreach approach, of course, because this project is going to impact a lot of people. And so part of our approach includes providing dedicated public information officers from both the city side and PCL side. We're developing a public information plan and a crisis communication plan. We have a number of public outreach tactics that we're implementing, including providing materials in English and Spanish and making sure those materials are ADA accessible. We'll have a 24/7 hotline and website, really clear, concise wayfinding and signage. Want to make sure we communicate key project information in progress using a lot of different media, renderings, infographics, flyers, newsletters, e-blasts, website updates. We'll have a number of pop-up events, and of course, we are going to coordinate with other projects like the Convention Center expansion and any Skyline Park work that could be going on. Want to also mention that Denver's Department of Economic Development and Opportunity is providing business support. As we mentioned, the mall is home to over 300 businesses. 200 are really directly located on the mall, and about half of those 200 are locally owned. So for 2021, DOTI has $300,000 dedicated to support these mall businesses, and that support will come in the forms of technical assistance, helping them prepare for construction activities, small business stabilization grants, and identification and support in attracting potential new mall tenants. And DOTI is committed to identifying and trying to find additional funding to support businesses in future budget cycles. Wanted to take a minute to talk about typical construction on a typical mall block. So what this graphic is showing, we've removed some buildings for clarity, but it's showing overall the phasing of construction. And construction is going to progress from Market Street to Broadway, and it's going to be continuous and contiguous. So construction is not going to skip blocks. It has to be linear. And the construction will be typically in 3 phases. The first phase will be construction within this, transit way and extended limits. And while the construction is occurring in this zone, pedestrians will be safely routed alongside the storefronts. This will be really the longest duration, likely a little bit over a year. One thing to note, we do have constraints and requirements that limit the construction on a mall block to no more than 18-month duration. So after this first phase, PCL will flip the construction, and pedestrians will be safely routed within what will be the new transit way and construct work adjacent to the buildings while providing access to buildings and shops and restaurants and spaces that people need to get into. And then the final stage will be, when they're ready to basically install the public life elements, the FF&E elements. And this will be a briefer duration. So overall, these 3 phases will be limited to 18 months in duration. And throughout, accessibility will be maintained for pedestrians and bicycles, and the routing will be ADA accessible. And I'd like to just hand this over to David Krutzinger, DOTI Transit Director, to talk briefly about coordination with RTD.
Thanks, Travis. Thanks for you and Jason giving a great presentation on all this information. RTD and Denver will be closely aligned and coordinated on this as this goes into construction to make sure that we minimize transit impacts and maximize the project success. We'll work together to communicate to riders when individual blocks or groups of blocks will be going into construction so that people know how to plan their trips, whether they're going downtown for work or for convention or for pleasure. So we're looking forward to keeping our communication high and delivering a great project.
Thank you, David. Just real quick, a brief overview of next steps. As I mentioned, we're in the pre-construction phase, and we're going to be doing some of our additional due diligence and construction enabling work, which will be the potholing, surveying, and some of the early utility relocations I mentioned. We're also, of course, coordinating the work with the summer events, like Jason mentioned, the Meet in the Street. And we do anticipate starting some of that construction enabling work at the intersections later this year, with the full construction mobilization, as I mentioned, next summer. So that concludes our presentation, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. We've got, I'll kind of group some questions thematically here. Maybe some questions about the design. Several years were spent on the design. John Rickey has a couple good questions about why didn't we rethink moving the transit way? I know these are all decided, but just reminding people why the transit way is remaining here rather than spreading the love on 15th and 17th, and then raise pedestrian crossings as pedestrians go along the 16th Street Mall, crossing the named streets. Jason, you want to give a background on the design?
Yeah, absolutely. These are excellent, thoughtful questions, and they were part of the overall evaluation, part of looking at the importance of the mall really as that pedestrian and transit way. As a reminder, when the mall was being sort of thought of in the 70s and being evaluated, the role of the mall was really to take about 500 bus trips a day off of other city streets, make that really that last and first mile connection, consolidate it on the mall as part of that mall and transit way. And so it is really important for us. It's important for RTD as that first and last mile connection, particularly as consolidating those bus trips from other streets and looking at them and working with RTD. Another thing that we had and sort of the engagement that was out there was really important that the shuttles in particular created a level of activation on the street, which was important. And so the idea that that walking happening on those named streets in those spines is really, really important to us. And it's in some strategies that we're still working on how to make this a good connected downtown, but keeping the vibrancy, keeping some of the life and those early hours and late hours on the mall with the shuttles, all were really very important and important to the community and downtown community and other input that we had along the way. So it was important for us to evaluate a variety of input and understand kind of the role and the importance of that transit along with pedestrian and walking. And I see even kind of the questions about bicycles, continuing to have the bicycle access on the mall available on weekends. This was important to us.
So the crosswalks, as you're walking along the mall, when you get to a street, you're not going to be level. You'll go down to the street bed and then back up as normal. Is that right?
The condition will be as normal. The engineering and the role of stormwater and some other elements downtown is not my realm of expertise, but I know that we're studying it and evaluating it, but particularly some of these engineering issues made it less possible as far as I understand, but I don't know the engineering well enough and I'm probably not the best to answer that question.
Okay. While we're talking about the engineering, Miles Tanglin has a question about historic elements being preserved, and Michael Hughes also all the discussion that was had about the IMPay elements. How did that turn out? What are we going to see?
We're really excited that after evaluating and going through the sort of the 106 consultation and the NEPA process, it was important for us to engage Historic Denver, our SHPO, Colorado Preservation Inc., and others as part of the process to understand what is the valuable parts of the mall, sort of the pattern itself, kind of the relationship of the white, the gray, the red, that sort of Navajo rug blanket history of the mall was very important, in addition to trees and kind of in a triangulated pattern and the historic replica lights that are actually just replaced in the last couple of years. Those were really important to people, and those things will all remain. It will be granite, it'll be new granite. It'll be granite with a different friction that on it, so it is less slippery, but it's going to return back to some of the vibrant colors that are there. Most people are not going to actually be able to even identify the subtle adjustments that we've made as we have shifted trees. The transit lane has been modified a little bit. There are some subtle adjustments to the relationship of a pattern, but beyond sort of people that are intimately involved in how that was thought through, a lot of the diagonal sort of approach, the sort of the two fit on diagonal dimension relationships remain very, very similar to what they are today.
Thanks. And I apologize to everyone. I'm just trying to cram in as many questions as we can. Just doing this in the chat is pros and cons. But several people are asking about trees. And I know there was an announcement recently about a mixed variety of trees and the fact that the trees have been already growing off-site for a number of years. What can people expect, and what were the decisions that had to be made?
Feel like I'm talking. Travis, do you want to tackle this or want me to grab it?
I'd go for it, Jason. You're doing great. Thank you.
Thanks, man. So we are really excited. One of the strategies is to actually keep in the theory of how the trees were originally designed. There were honey locusts through the central blocks, and at the ends there were red maples to actually get kind of a heavier shade pattern, more of a fall color approach. Some of the trees at the ends, since it was really two monocultures, died off in either a blight or something that happened to those trees. So the approach now is actually to create and actually have more trees on the wall. At the end blocks where there was 2 rows of trees, we're actually making them 3, which actually makes the blocks that actually are the most stark now because of the blight with those red oaks actually are going to be some of our luscious blocks, and will actually really increase the amount of downtown canopy that we have. And that the strategy of kind of that more speckled light and the 4 or 5 kind of species and families of trees in the middle of the block, we're kind of keeping with that same design approach, and more oaks and elms and other things at sort of the ends of the blocks was an important part of the design conversation, and to really create a good, healthy culture of trees in the space, and with larger amounts of area for the roots to grow, the roots to actually be able to touch, which we have found out to be very, very important in the life of trees, and advance sort of the ways that with some suspended paving systems or structured roll paving systems will help continue to help those trees really, really thrive in the future, rather than kind of go down to a spot where they were in the last sort of 10 years growing at 0.1 inches a year, which is again very, very, very limited growth, and getting very, very stagnant. Those trees starting to kind of not thrive and actually start to really die off. So this is actually a good time for us to double down on our downtown canopy, understand that those trees were not actually doing well and we're going to need replacement, and using this as the time to actually give them a better chance at success in our downtown environment. Really thank the trees for a good life and a really important canopy in our downtown.
Thanks. There's a lot more we can get to. We do tend to cram a number of topics in here. Let me do 2 things. Let me ask you to share with us how people can be in touch with the project team, sign up for things, ask questions offline. And then I would also like to invite you to stay on for as long as you want and respond to some questions in the chat that we didn't get to, because people are very thoughtful and very interested in these topics. How can people learn more and stay in touch?
So the best way to learn more and get the most accurate information is going to our DOTI website. We have current projects, and there's a web page for the 16th Street Mall. We can put that in the chat as soon as we finish this Q&A, and that'll direct you to information and where you can email questions, the 24/7 hotline, and it also will announce upcoming community opportunities for participation in the project.
Great. Well, I do hope you'll stay with us for a little bit and have some chat. And we're going to move to the next topic here. Thank you very much, all 3 of you, all 4 of you. David, thanks for joining early to chime in on transit. We're going to move to Denver Moves Everyone. So a number of years ago, Denver did a strategic transportation plan. It was important for shaping thinking about what they called travel sheds, how to organize projects along the major north-south and east-west corridors through the city that people move in. But I wouldn't say it was a very well-known plan, because it wasn't the kind of plan that was like highly visual, talking about community desires. It was more organizing projects. Doing an evolution on that thinking, we have a presentation today from Sam Piper. Sam is leading the effort for the new strategic transportation plan, which is called Denver Moves Everyone, keeping with the theme of the Denver Moves names. And he's asked that I share my screen, right, Sam?
Yeah, that would be great, Joel, if you don't mind.
Great, and we'll move through this. So just to kick us off, this is not rethinking all the planning we've just done. This is organizing the planning we've just done, right?
You've got it. Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Well,
yes. The plan to build on all of the great planning work.
Okay.
The city is done. So, well, Joel, I appreciate that introduction, and thank you again for the invitation to present this evening. And before I dig in, my name is Sam Piper. I'm a transportation planner with DOTI. So you saw the presentation on 16th Street Mall, colleagues of the folks who gave that presentation. I am on our transportation planning team. And as Joel noted, we are embarking on a really exciting effort, which we are calling Denver Moves Everyone. And this is our new long-range strategic transportation plan, and will become our vision to move people, goods, and services out to the year 2050. So it is a long planning horizon. And as I update you tonight about the kind of the scope of the work, and as well as our public engagement approach, I'll kind of provide some details about While it is a long-range plan, we are really going to be focusing on the near term and in coordinating projects, programs, and policies. So on the next slide, if you flip to the next one, yep. So this is just a quick overview of the topics that I'm hoping to cover. And so I'll provide an overview about the plan and, really why are we doing this comprehensive planning effort right now? And then I'll kind of get into the weeds a little bit and talk about our approach, both from the technical standpoint as well as from the public engagement approach. And then I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about some of our key technical activities that we're starting to kick off, and just kind of pause and ask for some discussion and some topics that you all would like us to investigate. So on the next slide, so just kind of to frame this conversation, I'm sure that INC and this group is aware of the fact that our city has changed dramatically over the last decade. And I won't go through all of these statistics, but we've grown by 100,000 people since the last time, as Joel noted, the city and Public Works at the time actually embarked on a strategic transportation plan. And over that time, we've seen trends moving in the right direction, and we've seen trends moving in the wrong direction. And as you kind of go through these statistics, when we look at housing prices and indicators of equity, as well as things from a Vision Zero perspective and the safety of our streets, again, trends kind of moving in the right direction and the wrong direction. And what we want to do is essentially be able to harness these trends in the most positive way possible. And instead of just reacting to the reality that our city, as all signs are indicating, is going to continue to grow in the future, we need to harness these trends in the most positive way possible. And so the best way to do that is to plan for our future as opposed to reacting to that. And so not only has the city around us changed, but one of the key catalysts for initiating this project right now is also our organization has changed. And Joel, if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight for the group, this is kind of a sampling of our division's logos really over the last 20 years. And again, the last time we did the 2008 Strategic Transportation Plan was the first time that DOTI was really, or Public Works at the time, was really instituting this approach and policy and building projects that were more than kind of just looking at level of traffic stress, which is a way to make sure traffic is moving efficiently on our roadways, and it kind of expanding the scope of our responsibility to moving people. And that really helped to set the foundation for new programs, which were developed and established in the 2010s. So kind of in this middle box here, we started to stand up our very first bicycle program, our very first pedestrian program. The city started to construct sidewalks adjacent to private property for the first time in the agency's history. In addition to that, we established our first transit program. And now David, who presented previously, our first transit director with the city. And one of the other outcomes of this was the recognition that we became a Vision Zero city. So we as an organization and as the city and county of Denver prioritized the recognition that we want to eliminate serious injuries and traffic fatalities on our streets. And this really all culminated in 2019 through the vote from the residents of our city to change our charter and to actually transition from a public works agency to a Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. And again, this is just really ratifying the recognition that the scope of our responsibilities is really about moving people. So when we talk about Denver moves everyone, this plan is really necessary right now and critical to align our new organizational structure with the fact that we have a lot of new mobility programs so that we can align projects, programs, and policies over the long term to move the needle on all of the goals that we have been establishing through previous planning efforts, in which we will codify through this planning effort to just make sure our organization is moving as best we can in concert to making progress on those goals. And so as we look to the future on the next slide, we know, transportation is ever evolving. When we look at the last 100 years, went from a pedestrian city to an automobile oriented city. And as I've just discussed, these new mobility programs coming into our organization. And as we look to the horizon, we know change is going to happen. I don't know if folks have seen these towers popping up. Initially, I thought that they were just kind of funny looking streetlights, but they're the new 5G infrastructure, which is being implemented around Denver. That's that picture on the left. And 5G, as experts are saying, is the technology which is going to be necessary to enable connected and autonomous vehicles to operate in urban environments. So we're seeing that technology being implemented. And again, over this 2050 planning horizon, we anticipate that connected and autonomous vehicles will be something that we will see. And we want to not react to that. We want to be proactive with that technology and manage any potential externalities that could come out of that. Electrification of vehicles. We're seeing Tesla, one of the most valuable car manufacturers in the world right now, and really establishing the viability of electric vehicles. And we anticipate that the electrification of our fleet is going to continue. And how can we, again, leverage that both on the personal vehicle side, but also potentially in collaboration with our freight partners to move the needle on some of our mobility goals and reducing pollution and greenhouse gas emissions related to the internal combustion engine. And then, this kind of picture here in the middle about the Amazon Dropbox. But the point being is that we do anticipate e-commerce, again, is going to change a lot. When we look at European countries and China, the rate of e-commerce adoption is higher than it is in the United States. And with the pandemic, we have seen a dramatic increase in boxes coming to our home. And we do think these changes are going to be durable. So with kind of the diversification of freight and, smaller vehicles, more last mile trips from distribution facilities to our homes, how can we manage that? And how can we plan for that change? And how does our street networks need to kind of react to that? And then kind of personal mobility. We've seen scooters come online the last decade. As a person who had worked in this field for a decade, I have to acknowledge I worked on bike share, but I didn't see scooters coming. And now, as folks probably have heard, council just approved the new contract to have 2 scooter operators in Denver. So again, personal mobility, electric bikes, we know changes on the horizon. So this is just a kind of a snapshot, but again, just underlining and really emphasizing the critical nature of doing a planning effort like this right now. And so on the next slide here, kind of bringing this all together, what is Denver Moves Everyone? So I've kind of talked and framed about the importance of doing a comprehensive planning effort like this right now. And now I just wanted to kind of talk through the technical details of what we'll be delivering. So we're kind of thinking about, what is the future that we envision and what is the city that we want to be? And the plan is really that middle piece of being the document, the guiding document, and the resources to ensure that we're making progress to become the city that we all collectively want to be. And so on the next slide, the project is divided into these 4 different phases. So we kicked off internally in February of 2021. It is a 2-year planning effort. And our first task is really focused on this left box on the left here. And this is going to run through early fall of this year. And what we're calling this is setting the foundation, where we're really trying to just understand where are we today and what are our values. And so, as Joel mentioned, in terms of a value statement, we've done Blueprint Denver, we've done Denver Right, game plan. So there's been a lot of citywide visioning around what are those values. And we really don't want to reinvent the wheel there, but we do want to align our goal framework and create a goal framework for Denver Moves Everyone that can fit within the Denver Right vision elements, but also reflect the mobility goals of DOTI as well as the community's values. And then this will be combined to develop what we're calling a performance framework. So this is going to be a performance-based plan. So we'll be developing goals, objectives, and metrics that can be measured to ensure that we're consistently making progress on our goals and moving towards those vision elements established in Denver Right. and kind of how do we get there and how do we anticipate the future? We're actually be developing a version of the DRCOG travel demand model, which is a tool that enables us to forecast future transportation trends and understand changes and how we can make multimodal investments to manage different future scenarios. And all of this will culminate in a state of the system report. Then as we kind of move through the process, our next step will be finding the path forward. And so we'll actually be using the tools and the goals and kind of performance framework we would have established in the first task to move to the next stage where we're really trying to look through scenarios. As I mentioned, some of those big trends that we can see coming down the pipe, connected autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles. How can we look at different future travel scenarios so that we can build and invest and develop programs and policies and non-infrastructure investments to ensure that what future we are building is moving us closer to our mobility goals. So we really are trying to be, move in a concerted effort as we develop these scenarios that are advancing us towards our goals. And then as we move, now we'll be in February of 22, and we get into the programming and phasing stage. And this is where we're actually going to be developing and augmenting a fiscally constrained capital improvement program where we're going to be identifying projects that have the best mix of project, best network of projects that is moving us closest to achieving our mobility goals. And again, that's where that kind of performance framework comes in, where we're building projects that score highly on our metrics and move the needle. But it's not just projects, it's also what are the policy and the program needs? And from an organizational perspective, are there investments in staff or other tools or needs that we need to make to consistently make progress on the goals which we will have established through the project? And then, kind of looking towards the end of the timeline here, we'd be moving into, summer of 2022 as we move into the fall. And this tracking and reporting is just kind of, keeping ourselves honest. We will have, worked through a lot of planning, synthesizing, so much good work that has been established, not reinventing the wheel, and really just putting DOTI within a consistent framework to move collectively towards our mobility goals. And we just want to be able to ensure that, the projects that we've identified are in fact moving us closer to those goals. So we'll be establishing performance standards and reporting dashboards to just make sure that we are consistently on track so we can communicate these findings to the community as well as to DOTI's management. And the bottom line here is, that you kind of see these arrows moving across the bottom, is that we are consistently going to be engaging the public at these major milestones, asking consistent questions. And I'll talk more about the engagement framework. And on the next slide, so I've kind of talked about this a little bit, but, really just to underscore that importance of planning for uncertainty. So, kind of as we look around this graphic here, the pandemic especially has just motivated us even to a more significant degree to recognize the importance of this project. And so when we think about investment priorities with the significant investment from the federal government and the American Jobs Act, we need to kind of get our ducks in the row on shovel ready projects, and DOTI really recognizing that we are going to be a major factor in the economic recovery of our city. So we've already got a lot of great work moving in that direction. How can this plan really augment that work and, think about the future in terms of risk and resiliency? Is a pandemic something that we need to anticipate in the future? That everyone was caught off guard, but this is a long planning horizon. So that's something that we'll be investigating. When we think about travel behavior, into this plan, prior to the pandemic, the AM/PM peak period was something that had been consistent since the dawn of transportation planning and engineering. And now we're evaluating, are people going to, come back to the central business district at the same level? Will that AM/PM peak period be as durable as it was before the pandemic? Are we going to have a mix of kind of this hybrid work environment that a lot of people are talking about. Some work at home, some back in the office. So we need to understand that. We also need to understand in kind of get people back on the bus when it comes to transit. We've seen a reduction in transit due to the pandemic, and transit is a critical component of us meeting our mode shift goals of a 15% mode shift on transit. And so again, how can we leverage this plan to get people comfortable with taking transit again? And again, just kind of coming around the circle, funding and investment. The pandemic has really made us need to plan more strategically about our future. So I think that this is just kind of some interesting facts for us to investigate early in this process that due to the pandemic, we need to start asking ourselves. So yeah, Joel, on the next slide, I've kind of talked a lot about the technical work that we'll be leading, but I just wanted to emphasize that this project is only successful by having a comprehensive and inclusive public engagement approach, which is really engaging people where they are and providing multiple opportunities for people to engage using methods that work best for them. And so these are just kind of some of our goals for our outreach program. And on the next slide, this slide really kind of demonstrates the multifaceted outreach approach that we're going to be taking for this project to ensure that we are being comprehensive and inclusive. So this is kind of a 3-tiered strategy, but all of these are working in parallel and launched at the same time. So we'll have a citywide digital strategy using online tools and virtual meetings to share information across the city and really enabling people to engage with the project on their own time. The second tier here is really committee and partner networks. So we have several tiers of outreach committees, which will be engaging through the project, all the way from city council going to a think tank, which would be an external steering committee for the project, also standing up inclusive voices, groups of people who represent different communities and backgrounds within Denver who may experience transportation differently, and then topical focus groups. So really zooming into those, industry focus groups that we need to get perspective from and incorporate into the plan. And then this third tier is really, Denver is not all the same from a land use and a transportation perspective. And so we are actually going to be dividing the area into 6 sub areas that have a homogeneous kind of land use and transportation composition, and be able to do outreach at these sub area levels and tailor the storytelling about the history of transportation and what that area may value from a future perspective, so that we can, again, just be more tailored in our messaging for the project. And then all together, we'll be tracking, the metrics on these tactics to ensure we're being successful. And our first outreach tactic is really developing goals. So we'll be going out to the community to ask them about what are those values. And we've done a comprehensive scan of our internal planning documents, both within DOTI, within our city partner agencies, as well as our regional partners. And through this comprehensive scan, we have categorized all of the different goals and vision elements and objectives from these different plans into consistent categories. And so we'll be going out to the public in the month of June to do some storytelling around themes that speak to these values, which consistently came up through this, what we're calling plan scan. And we'll ask people to affirm that, are these the values that are still priorities? And then actually helping us to prioritize those values. And then we'll be using the output from this outreach to actually develop goals for Denver Moves Everyone, which fit within the Denver Right vision element framework, which are those icons on the right of the slide. And so, kind of wanted to just tee up the fact that we will be developing this travel demand model. Again, Dr. COG, which is the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Denver region, has a travel demand model, but it needs to be calibrated for the entire Metro Denver region. And Metro Denver region is very large geographically. And the fact that it needs to be calibrated for the entire region means that, that the Denver area of that model may not exactly reflect kind of the transportation investments or the behavior that we want to be able to model, because we do have really ambitious mobility targets and mode shift goals for Denver. And so we're going to be tailoring the DRCOG model for the Denver area. And some of the things that we can do with that is we can understand current and future travel and land use changes. We have some of the largest new development areas of any large American city in the United States. And by that, I mean River Mile and the Stadium District. So we're going to be making significant changes to land use. We need to be able to understand what are the transportation changes that we can see from those, and how can we make investments so that, it's not just drive alone trips to get to those places. We can test different growth and transportation scenarios. I talked a lot about technology. We can actually model different technology to see how those could potentially impact our community. And we can test different investment scenarios to make sure that, that scenario that we are investing in has the best chance of moving the needle most on our mobility goals. So Joel, I know I'll only have a few minutes left here, but maybe I could just open it up to questions from you. I'd be happy to cover really anything, but this was a prompt that, is there any questions that INC would like us to explore, either in the modeling task or in other tasks?
We've got a few in the chat. So John Ricky, you asked about we already have commitment to modal priority. Why don't you ask your question?
Hello. Yes. Early on in the while you were in the presentation, you said you were looking for ways to get modal priority established and implemented. And we already have these goals. They exist in numerous plans, and we see them regularly ignored in favor of free parking or, whatever, cars. So what does this plan add that will actually implement that?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. So I think the key distinction is that you're correct. We do have mobility goals, but they operate within kind of these siloed documents, which is, Denver moves bikes, or Denver moves transits, Denver moves peds and trails. And we want to pull up all of the recommendations to have a kind of a multimodal transportation mobility goal framework that makes the recognition that by, for instance, making investments in walking and biking infrastructure, those have shared goals to move the needle on Vision Zero. Making investments in both bicycling and transit infrastructure moves the needle on reducing potential reliance on single occupancy vehicle trips. So a real purpose of this project is we want to synthesize and bring all of these mobility goals together so that we can create comprehensive metrics, so that we're not just implementing a bike program or a transit program, but we're implementing mobility programs that collectively work together to make the most impact to move the needle on our mobility goals.
So then I've got a follow-up. If we don't meet those goals, what happens? And two, if we don't meet those goals because council people veto them, what happens?
So yeah, great questions. I think, so I'll answer the first one first. And right now, we don't have a great framework. I kind of described that yellow box at the end of our timeline to evaluate how much progress we are making on these goals. And again, comprehensively. I mean, we can look at, some data points from the census to indicate mode shift, but we want to be more comprehensive in the metrics that we're tracking to ensure that we are making progress on our goals. And when this isn't just like a one-shot plan, and then we kind of, sit back and say, oh, we've done our work. What this plan will enable us to do is to be is to give us the tools so that we can consistently track progress. And if we're not meeting our goals, we need to change either our investments or our policies or our programs to remove those roadblocks so that we can continue to make progress there. So again, this is just a process by which we can establish how much success we are having. And then if we're not being successful towards our metrics, it's an indication for us that we need to change projects, policies, or programs so that we can continually reach our goals.
Let me throw to David Mincer, who had a great question on project selection, because I think a lot of this prioritization will speak to project selection in the future. David?
Hi, thanks. I was recently looking at the DRCOG tip request that Denver put out, and there's things like 50 million for I-25 and Alameda interchange, and looks like 250 million for Pena Boulevard widening. And meanwhile, our bike program is so underfunded, we're using plastic sticks to kind of make our bike lanes. So I was wondering, will this plan set, really guide the funding priorities of our city, and will there be mechanisms to enforce those priorities?
Yeah, great question, David. So yes, this project will develop a prioritization process, and what we'll be doing so I talked about the vision, goals, objectives, metrics framework. So we're going to be developing a prioritization process, which as projects are evaluated against, we'll be able to determine which mix of projects or portfolio of projects has the best scores against those metrics that then can achieve our objectives and move us closer to our mobility goals. So we will be creating that, and it will have a real impact on the projects that we fund, because it's going to be selecting or prioritizing those that have the best chance of reaching our mobility goals.
I don't know who's responsible for making the tip requests, but they're very highway dominated. And I mean, will those be revisited? Will we decide we're not going to spend 250 million on Pena Boulevard? I guess that's a question mark.
Yeah, so at this point, we will be making evaluations about a long-term capital improvement program. And so we're thinking about maybe 4 to 6 years is going to be the fiscally constrained capital improvement program that we will develop through Denver Moves Everyone. And then beyond that, we want to understand, well, out to 2050, what does that unconstrained program look like? And which investments do we need to prioritize? So yes, we will be evaluating that and the tip selections.
We're a little bit over time. I would, of course, invite you to stay and answer other questions that have come in the chat. I think one of the more pressing ones is in terms of project prioritization. If next week, next month, next quarter, a lot of money falls from the sky, whether it's the federal government or state or these various programs, is this effort, or is something DOTI's already done, have our clear near-term shovel-ready goals that are aligned with our values?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And DOTI has been working actively to look at a fiscally constrained 3-year capital improvement program, which we're calling SPARK. And so this is really organizing work that we had already identified that we need to build, but is putting us in position to ensure that if we were to get additional support from the federal government, that we have identified those projects over the next 3 years to move faster. So I think that this project is looking to really inform our capital improvement program starting in 2024, and the SPARK program is going through 2023.
Okay, thank you very much. Please stay with us in the chat. And folks, these are always abstract kind of things when we're early in a project that's a project to organize our plan. So I appreciate that this group is receiving early kind of word about this and will follow it, but it's inherently a little more abstract than some of the things. But going down to the next level of tangibility, our next presentation is also planning and prioritizing goals and efforts we've already laid out in Denverite in the Denver Moves Transit, and saying which of these are we going to implement first, how much are they going to cost, what's our priority. And that's Denver Moves Transit Part 2. At the end of the Denver Moves Transit effort, it ended saying we recommend a Part 2 to prioritize the corridors and the capital improvements that were laid out in Denver Moves Transit. And that's the key work that's going to make transit work better on our streets, make transit competitive. More people will choose to use it if it's frequently coming and it's not stuck in traffic, etc. So I'd like to invite Justin Begley to start his presentation. And Justin, I think you're going to share your screen, so I'm going to make you a co-host. and you should be able to share that. And again, we're also joined by David Kretzinger, who's the Director of Transit for Denver. And Justin, why don't you unmute and let us know you're here. I'm sorry.
Sure. Hi, everybody. While I get this spun up, I know David's going to start with an introduction.
Okay, David.
That might be good.
Yeah, thanks, Joel and Justin. We're excited to follow on what Sam was presenting for Denver Moves Everyone. In many respects, parallel effort to take the vision that was created and finished in 2019 and spend more time on prioritization and implementation. How do we meaningfully move the ideas to reality? So that's the overall gist of what Justin's going to talk about, and I'll turn it over to Justin. We'll look forward to answering questions at the end of this, and as well as maybe dovetailing some of those answers back to Sam's presentation. Take it away, Justin.
Okay, so you can see me. Can you hear me? I think you can.
Looks good, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, Denver Moves Transit Phase 2, very creatively named. But really what it is advancing the vision that came from the first Denver Moves Transit study, which I believe was adopted in 2019. So following out of what we believe was a very successful plan, and it's kind of given us the ammunition to be a lot more deliberate and intentional about building out transit networks within the city. That's what Phase 2 is getting us more into the implementation phase. So David introduced himself a little bit. He's the director of for transit in the city. I'm currently the acting transit supervisor for the planning team, and we do have a lot of what's happening at the city on transit coming out of the planning group right now. And obviously we're here to talk to you today about Denver Moves Transit. So working to translate the abstract into something a bit more tangible. You know, I think the timing of Sam's presentation was pretty good. If you look at that top row, the Denver Right and comp planning efforts that kind of set the very, very high land use and transportation vision for the city now need to get flowed down into more actionable things. And so Sam's plan just mentioned here, the Denver Moves Everyone plan kind of sits at that high level. And transit is a very important piece of how we're going to get to a place where we get to 15% of trips in the city are taken by transit, because that was a goal that was set forward in the mayor's mobility action plan by 2030. So, you know, how are we getting there? Denver Moves Transit 1, you see the arrow there. Again, set the vision, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. We've been staffing up. We've been trying to get resources to deliver and set ourselves up to deliver transit. When I say deliver transit, yes, it means everything from wheels on the street to the transformation of our corridors to better support transit. And so that's what you see here in these sub-bullets under the DMT2 line, right? Yes, we are intentionally and deliberately getting into a place that we did not earlier, which is service planning and providing service potentially. I'll get into that. And then the three bullets underneath, the corridor investments, priority investments, and bus stop investments. We kind of think of it as the building blocks to transforming the streets in Denver to be more transit supportive. So, you know, at the base level, we have a study that's looking at all 2,900 bus stops in the city and saying, what should these stops look like based on where they're located, how many people are using them, the places that the bus stops allow people who use those stops to go, because those stops are really kind of the gateway, right, to the network. And they're important. And I think people a lot of times see them as the domain of RTD, and they're served by RTD, but they're able to be improved in partnership with locals like the city. So bus stops are important, and we're dedicating a study to support DMT2 to sort out how we do this. Above that is the bus priority investment study. You know, we can improve the bus stops, make bus stops more safe and comfortable for waiting. But if you get on a bus and you are in congestion with cars that are, driven or occupied at a level of 1 to 1.5 people per car, we're not doing everything we could, right? So we could be taking that bus, unfortunately with COVID, we have limited capacities, but in typical times with 30, 40 people on it, giving it priority on streets, giving it priority at intersections. And that's what that bus priority study does, is look at how to take the streets and make the very ordinary RTD local buses operate more quickly through those streets and better on-time performance. Because we need people on those buses to know, if I'm taking it to work, it's going to get where I'm going on time. If I have to make a connection, I can make that connection because bus priority improvements will allow me to get where I'm going with greater certainty. The third building block is, on top of the bus stops and on top of the corridor improvements to make the buses go better, we're going to have some high value investments on corridors where we move the greatest numbers of people through the city. So an arterial type BRT program. Obviously, Colfax BRT is a well-known and understood entity. It's been around a while, but there are other corridors in the city where we're going to need to focus investment to make them accommodate the high numbers of people that travel transit on them every day. So this study, and this is really, something I think I didn't catch that part of Sam's presentation, but he mentioned equity. We need to do a better job understanding how we're going to get where we're going to go by understanding where we've been and understanding the way the city has been grown. And this is not all specific to Denver. These are more national, some local issues, but basically Jim Crow laws, which, restricted who could vote, Federal Highway Act, which put interstates through communities as a way to break up blight as it was imagined back then. I mean, things like covenants, which limited who people could sell their homes to, concentration of poverty, and redlining, which has gotten a lot of attention as well. We're looking at this through the Denver Moves Transit process, again, to kind of set the stage for who we're trying to serve and how did it get this way, as some pretext for the work of implementation. So we, as people who've been here for a minute, know we've been the Department of Public Works for quite a while, and this isn't uncommon in many cities to have a public works department, but in order to get to a place in which we could begin to move mode shifts in ways beyond a typical capital program. The capital program is very important, but we also need the ability to administer non-capital programs as well as potentially operate services, as in addition to other things that go beyond the typical things that a public works department does that may be more heavy infrastructure focused on just providing utilities and things to the city. So the charter change to a DOT is really the catalyst for us to be able to do more with transit. Denver Moves Transit, as we talked about, and as this committee, I'm sure, was involved in to some degree, or access for that plan, adopted in 2019. A lot of visionary, like what should transit look like in the city, was very important to define then, but it needed a second phase to take these big moves as identified at a vision level. High quality, reliable transit. High quality meaning frequency. Frequency, reliability. So buses show up when you expect them to and get you to where they're intended to get you going when the provider tells you that. Access and connection is very important. David and I have been talking some about that since his joining the city, looking at some places that maybe are geographically should be better served by transit, but they're kind of falling through the gaps. So I think we have an opportunity there to improve some connections between places that are not currently well served. Building a sense of place and making the most out of our investments, I think those are more general terms. Again, the goals for Denver Moves Transit, I'm not going to read through all these. You can take a look. it's consistent with what I've talked about so far. It also may be some things about how to program and find sustainable funding, right? So transit's expensive on a capital side, transit's recurringly expensive on an operating side. And at the levels, we've been able to identify so far, we'll definitely keep movement on the program, but we're going to have to find more money to realize our goals, as with all of these transportation improvements. So some details there. Coming out of the first phase of Denver Moves Transit, again, these are vision networks. I just want to orient you to what you see on the left are the capital investment corridors. The darker colors imagine a higher intensity of development for transit there, things like a bus rapid transit line with very high frequencies. Blue corridors could be rapid bus, think something more like a speed and reliability to a BRT line. And then green would intended to be more something like frequent local buses, but maybe not with that level of investment. So that's driven by data, that's driven by public input, and that sets the stage for how do we implement that when we get to phase 2. On the right, Denver's frequent transit network is hiding, the legend's hiding behind the boxes. I can't see it, but I do know the red corridors, you're thinking very frequent transit, right? So we already have 3-4 minute frequencies on corridors like Colfax, but we need to expand that high level of service in a grid so people can move more quickly through the city. And then that orange color, I believe, is the 15-minute frequent transit network. 15 minutes in a lot of ways needs to be our floor for quality transit. Once we start to get into 20 and 30-minute frequencies, transit becomes a lot less useful for people. So these visions set forward a very ambitious program, and Denver Moves Transit Phase 2 has to translate that vision into a program to deliver it. Just a little bit of organization around the program itself. It's largely consistent with what I've shown you so far. Really, these first 3 boxes, those building blocks, passenger amenities here is kind of a proxy for bus stops, but it could also be things like mobility hubs and other things that improve the bus stop experience for people when you're not on the bus. The speed and reliability treatments and capital investment corridors, rebuilding the public right of way to allow transit to be a preferred and effective way to get around the city. And where we've really kind of rapidly moved into is our services and programs. And so the micromobility program, microtransit, which we're hopefully launching later this summer in the Montbello community as a pilot, as ways to say, we know the arterials in the city and the other corridors with 40-foot buses on them. If we can get you within a quarter mile or less from access to that corridor, that's great. There are going to be gaps in the city. And how do we bridge those gaps with alternatives, knowing, a 40-foot bus and the cost to operate it, we're in the millions of dollars to do that, but microtransit, we can use that to fill these gaps. We're doing some planning around that now, and we hope to have a more robust offering in that in the coming years. I heard some good questions earlier about, measuring and tracking coming out of our plan. These speed and reliability corridors we have, these are the ones that have been implemented so far. I can tell you we have some in planning and development, but we're tracking towards that goal. We certainly have some funding, particularly on the bus stops side, and some packages moving forward to improve bus stops. We're trying to be strategic around getting those bus lanes out. Where are they going to have the most effectiveness, and then expanding them outside of, let's say, just the downtown core. And then the speed and reliability cores, like I mentioned, where can we put some signal prioritization, some bulb outs of the bus stops to keep the buses in the travel lane so they're not fighting to get in and out. This is how we're currently tracking the program. It's got a ways to go, we know that. David, I see Colfax up here. Would you mind speaking a moment to Colfax? And then I can pick back up with service.
Sure, Justin. Just to round out our performance indicators. So, Justin mentioned that we're tracking a passenger amenity program. We're tracking our speed and reliability corridors. So we've got 5 major corridors that are going back to the map that Justin showed earlier. We got 5 major corridors that are shown for major capital investment. So we'll be doing these one at a time, just based on the funding stream. Colfax is the first one. We'll be launching into public involvement in June to get that to 30% design and move it towards construction. So we're happy to say that we're seeing some movement on that corridor, and we'll be able to make use of and spend money that Denver voters gave us a couple of years ago for the Elevate bond. Transit service. Denver, as Justin mentioned, we want to be collaborative with RTD in delivering a family of transit services that serve all of Denver's residents and take transit to a level of reaching people and destinations that can't be reached with regional dollars alone. So we did do a Cherry Creek pilot with Chariot Shuttle, 2018 to early 2019. That was kind of in a commercial area. Ford pulled back on their implementation of Chariot as a model. So we didn't get as much experience out of that, but we did get some valuable lessons learned. We're moving to try another service in Montbello starting late this summer. And we'll be able to use both of those experiences then to understand how Denver can continue to move into markets complementary to what RTD is able to provide. Turn it back to you, Justin. Thanks.
Justin, you're on mute.
Thank goodness it tells me I'm muted, and you did as well. So again, what do we want to get out of phase 2? Phase 1, lots of public input, lots of data analysis, gives us the vision, right? This is where we feel we could be to significantly influence that mode shift number that we want to realize. Now we have to translate that into a program. And how do we do it? So it could stack up the priority projects that move in the near term, the midterm, and the long term. Which we do lack a clear path to now understanding how those are the most effectively deployed. So empower a transit division, get transit with a big T stood up in the city so we can be more effective, right? So we have a lot of planners working on transit. We need more than that. There's got to be a more substantial presence to get this done. A preferred implementation scenario to realize that vision in one, I mentioned that. Funding strategies, again, the question came up, are we, is the city ready to capture federal infrastructure bill, reauthorization, those things? The answer is for the transit program, yes. And we'll be in a lot better position at the conclusion of this study later this year. And then obviously, it's all built on an equitable past. How are the outcomes from improving the transit system going to be used to address that systemic inequity? Okay,
about 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Sure. Just wrapping up with schedule. We are obviously in the May timeframe. We're working on a prioritization tool. We'll have some scenarios drafted, and we want to bring those scenarios on how we implement this to the task force, which I believe is actually now scheduled for the 1st or 2nd week of June. So we're pretty close to schedule, but we are generally tracking to have this wrapped up later this year. And with that, I think that concludes the presentation.
Oh, okay, great. Let me start with a general question. Christine O'Connor asked a question about kind of the sequence that we do things in. Let me find it and read it. Yes to giving priorities to buses, intersections, and more, but supply the additional fast, affordable, reliable transit, and then the other things will follow. So do the fast, affordable, reliable transit first, and then the infrastructure. David, what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Joel. The FAST is coming in 2 forms. Our major capital investments like Colfax BRT to give buses 10 to 20 minute travel time advantage over how they travel in traffic today. And then the other one was what Justin mentioned was our speed and reliability investments. So finding all those smaller places in the network and smaller budget related to that to give buses that jump at intersections, or at least not leave them behind trying to pull out from a curb, waiting for the kind driver to let them in. So that's the fast, affordable. I think that comes with money and working with money to either subsidize the transit service so we don't have to collect as much in fares, or structuring things a little bit different with RTD. So RTD is starting a fare study looking at the outfall from COVID, and also looking at how they'd like to maybe simplify things. So we'll be looking to participate heavily with that and invite your all's participation in that as well. And then I think going back to Sam's study, we want to take that modeling and look at places in the network where we've got people moving across the city, that it's largely car trips, because that's the only way you can do it in a reasonable amount of time, and find those corridors that aren't being served. So what comes to mind for me, just as an example, throw this out, as a diagonal trip from northeast to southwest on transit. It's probably at least 2 buses with a transfer, take you probably 2 to 3 times as long as a car. So if we can find a couple of those corridors and we can provide a different service, it helps people throughout Denver as a city and a county be able to get where they're going by transit in 30 to 45 minutes rather than an hour to hour and a half. Thanks.
Thank you. And in the first part of that, asking about fast and reliable service first, and then the infrastructure to follow. I mean, your answer was the infrastructure is what makes it fast and reliable. And that's my understanding of doing here, but of course, pushing on RTD as well. David Minzer has a really good question on follow through on plans we've already done. David?
Hi, thanks. There are a lot of plans already on the books. We have the Leetsdale corridor study was done in 2017, and CDOT, Leetsdale is under construction right now, and CDOT seemed totally unaware of those plans. And we have the Federal Boulevard study happening now. So my main question is, how do we turn these plans into reality? We have funding for Leetsdale right now. They're tearing it up, but somehow they didn't incorporate the transit plans from that study.
You want me to take it, David?
I'll
It's
start.
also a state question.
Yeah, I'll start with a broad answer, and Justin, feel free to add into that. I guess David M, the funding is what's driving it. Yes, CDOT's out there reconstructing some of it, but we don't have the money that's necessary to do the high quality, say, bus rapid transit corridor for that. The maps that Justin was showing in terms of the service corridors, there's 20 corridors that we're looking at between the north, south, and east, west. So we'll really be looking to you all and other groups that Sam mentioned in Denver Moves Everyone to help us prioritize and help us to show the value. And to some of the other comments in the chat, it may not be a rocket science at the level of trying to just prioritize pedestrians, bicycles, and transit in terms of moving more people, but it takes a lot of convincing to get people out of old habits.
Okay, great. We have a question from Steve Harley, and this is very similar to one that was asked of Sam. What are the ways we're using COVID, and maybe not COVID as the disease, but as the kind of economic reset, the ability, RTD couldn't run all the services that they had for financial reasons and health reasons. How are we using that as the city, but working with RTD to jumpstart a rethink, a rationalization driven by the vision in Denver Moves Transit? And thanks, Steve Harley, for teeing that up.
I'll mention something from Reimagine RTD, and maybe Justin can speak to some of the accountability committee things that have emerged after COVID. So Reimagine RTD is asking, I think, some really important policy questions about who should be doing what. Should RTD become a full service organization offering buses, trains, scooters, and bike share? Or is it other people's responsibility to offer those things? And I think this goes to the question of how things get paid for on a regional and a local level. I think many local governments, some are willing to put forward more money to continue to increase transit, some are not. So that may not be, say, a tax that could be passed at a regional level, but it could be a tax or it could be a reprioritization of funds at the local level. So I think those are some important questions. Justin, maybe speak to accountability committee and the involvement processes.
Sure. So I would say, almost without exclusion, we're trying to set a model for how to work with RTD to jointly move some things forward that they're stretched too thin or perhaps have their focuses in other places to be able to do. So, you mentioned the accountability committee, a lot of conversations there. Some of them are being moved into the Reimagine effort. Some are going to be addressed with recommendations coming out of that group. But one, just to answer the question, one place we've tried to be more visible and effective is to participate in partnerships conversation with them and demonstrating for the rest of the RTD region. We understand RTD there and looked at to carry not just people, but carry a lot of projects and responsibilities. But if we're going to see RTD succeed in the future, we have to be there with resources, coordination. When we're making our streets better for RTD, we're saving them money. We're, by getting the buses moving faster through traffic, we're saving them money from projects they may never even identify to get to. And we wanted to share that through the accountability committee and say, look, you can get more from RTD working in partnership than coming in and kind of saying, where's mine? So hopefully we'll continue to have more examples of that.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've kind of reached the end of the time for this segment, but as with the other speakers, I'd encourage you to stay around, answer more of the questions you saw come in with the chat. We'll continue following all of this, Denver Moves Transit Part 2 and the Accountability Committee. The best thing I heard to come out of the accountability recently was a clear message on focusing on ridership. And when you're focused on ridership, of course, it's informed by equity, it's informed by everyone needing to be able to move. But when the top line focus is ridership, that means you're providing more useful service that more people choose to use for more of the trips of their day. I think that aligns really well with what you're planning here with the infrastructure improvements in Denver. So we'll turn here to our last topic. So this one's a little different, a little departure from us. We tend to be very Denver focused. And now we're going to look far beyond Denver, not just across our borders, but in the whole region. I'm pleased to have James Souby here. And James, we haven't spoken, so I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. He is the chair of the Southwest Chief and Front Range Passenger Rail Commission. James, I'm going to make you a co-host so that you can share your screen. But if there's any difficulty,
actually, Joel, will you make me the co-host so I can run the slideshow for Jim?
Spencer, absolutely.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, it's great. Let me look here. Yeah, great. I'll do that. So, James, the floor is yours. There's exciting things happening with a ball that you all have been carrying for quite a while, and now there's some interesting opportunities opening up. This is a group.
Let me. Two things cross my mind. One, we just finished essentially a 2.5-year alternatives analysis study, which Spencer will present here in a minute. And then I'll take up the legislation and where that stands. And if you're familiar with it at all, I caution you that we've had 10 amendments in the last couple of days. So I'll try to focus just a little bit on those things. But mainly I'll just touch the highlights, Joel, and then hopefully people can ask questions of both of us. So let me turn it over to Spencer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. As Mr. Souby mentioned, my name is Spencer Dodge. I'm the liaison with the Front Range Passenger Rail Commission, working for CDOT. So I'm going to give you guys a very brief overview of the project and kind of where we are today. And then, like Jim mentioned, going to kick it over to him to discuss the bill. So again, just kind of some brief background here. What is Front Range Passenger Rail, right? So we're looking to reduce pressure on some of those key freight corridors up and down the Front Range by getting people off of those highways and really kind of focusing on that Pueblo to Colorado Springs to Denver and Fort Collins corridor. The idea is really for this to be a transportation spine for the region, with other multimodal systems like RTD, like Mountain Metro, like the Amtrak long distance lines, kind of integrating themselves into that Front Range Passenger Rail system. So it's kind of a blended team effort with CDOT staff and with the Rail Commission. We've got kind of the A team, as Director Lou likes to say, as far as engineering and ridership modeling and kind of the environmental planners as well. So we've got some of the best minds at CDOT on the project. Here we go. So I've got a delay. So over the last 2 years, we've really kind of kicked off the initial kind of preliminary alternatives analysis. We wrote up with the help of the HDR consultant team. We have really kind of made a lot of progress as far as some of that early pre-NEPA activity. So putting together a vision, doing some of that early environmental review work, ridership modeling to kind of figure out, where the people going to be riding this train, where can we best target these infrastructure improvements. Really high level conceptual cost estimating, looking at speed profiles and travel times, very early conceptual design plans, and then some funding and finance analysis, governance analysis. Quite a bit of effort went into public involvement and stakeholder engagement in various different ways, be that online or in person. Obviously not over the last 12 months, but prior to that, like quite a few public involvement and stakeholder engagement events up and down the corridor, all the way down to Trinidad. This is it's a big project. It's a regional project, and so we want to make sure we bring in as many voices as we can at this stage. So this is kind of our long-range vision, and I like to preface this slide by just kind of reminding folks that when we say long-range vision, this is kind of the best of the best. This is the Cadillac version of this system. It's gold-plated. Everything we could possibly want is represented right here, and that's kind of why you see such big numbers. 24 weekday round trips. That's a lot of trains running, right? But at its core, the travel times, this is our goal right here, right? 2.5 to 3 hours, running trains about 90 to 110 miles an hour, really doing our best to compete with travel times up and down I-25, both today and, 20 years in the future. So, looking at stations, we've got kind of 9 preliminary kind of primary stations identified with some secondary stations in there as well. Those secondary stations aren't finalized, the primary stations aren't finalized, just kind of some early work to kind of figure out, what does this service look like, who will we be serving? Those conceptual cost numbers, operating costs 135 to 172 million per year. We feel pretty good about those. The capital costs, about $8 billion to $14 billion. I do want to say here that, again, this is with double track, lots of passing sidings, lots and lots of infrastructure improvements that would really build out the most complete system. But a big project like this will not happen overnight, and so you'll see those capital costs kind of extended out over the duration of the development of this. It's not unlikely that we can kind of begin some passenger service to some lower level without making kind of $8 billion worth of improvements or whatever it may be. So again, this is kind of the gold standard here. This is really what we'd like to achieve in the end run. So I'm moving here. Specifically for Denver, though, I'd like to kind of highlight what we're looking at here. This is, of course, the most complex segment. There's a lot of different, for many reasons, right? Like there's a lot of different residential kind of hotspots. There's a lot of different employment hotspots. And then, technically, feasibly, it's a really constrained area as far as kind of expanding passenger expanding rail in general, be that freight or passenger. So really kind of having to thread a couple of needles through town is kind of one of the bigger engineering lifts there. So what we have seen, though, I will say on kind of the Denver area is that this is really where we see a bulk of our predicted ridership, particularly that Boulder to Denver corridor. I'm sure is not a huge surprise to many, as again, that's kind of one of the more denser areas along the Orange Passenger Rail corridor, both in terms of employment and residential. Excuse me. So looking at where we can put a train, the freight railroad alignment really kind of serves central Denver the best. It shares Denver Union Station as a hub, both for Amtrak and for RTD. So, you know, again, we can really kind of play off of these existing transit networks, interacting more with the commuter rail, with the buses in town. You know, we've looked at the potential to add an I-25 Broadway station on those freight alignments to serve as kind of a Denver Tech Center transfer. So, moving folks from the Springs who are coming up over to the Tech Center or down from the North Front Range to get them into that high employment area. So within Denver, you know, that's of course RTD's area. So we're coordinating very, very closely with them to make sure that, you know, we're not doing anything, you know, left hand's not doing anything the right hand can't see, kind of stepping on each other's toes. So really trying to stay as closely connected to them as possible. And so that freight rail alignment, and I'll explain these two alignments or three alignments on the right real quick. But the freight alignment, again, it's going to affect a little more, a few more streams, more open space areas and habitat. And it might also affect cultural and community resources. But again, this is with the assumption that we're building out with 2 or 3 tracks and really making a big footprint here. So through Denver, we've got kind of 3 alignments here that you can kind of see. The one going up through the middle is the BNSF freight rail alignment as it comes up through Castle Rock in the South Metro area. And then goes north along the I-25 commuter rail alignment towards Thornton and Westminster. This, I think it's, forgive me, I'm colorblind. I think it's teal maybe. And so looking at, again, this is the RTD Northwest Rail alignment, essentially where it goes Denver up to Louisville and Boulder and then on to Longmont. And then the final alignment that we've been looking at here is out on the eastern side is using kind of I-25 and then feeding into E-470 and going around towards Denver International Airport, and then cutting north towards Thornton and Westminster, heading north on I-25. So those are kind of the 3 that we've identified as the most feasible. One note that I will add here is that at the last Front Range Passenger Rail Commission, the commission did vote to kind of recommend that Northwest Rail alignment out to Boulder. It's kind of their preference. We're trying to kind of look towards the future and recognize, you know, what's the most viable and what might be the most productive in terms of ridership, without also kind of predetermining those NEPA questions. And so, you know, it's a recommendation that's not, of course, finalized or permanent or anything like that, but just something to note that there's some pretty strong movement towards that Northwest Rail alignment from the Rail Commission and additionally from groups throughout the state, as I'm sure you guys can imagine. So where we are today, like I mentioned, we've done that big kind of first step, the alternatives analysis, looking at that full corridor from Fort Collins all the way down to Pueblo. And so now we're kind of looking as a rail commission, looking at those early implementation strategies. So, you know, how can we start getting these passenger trains running? And so really kind of focusing in on identifying viability of the interoperations with the freight railroads, you know, making sure, or trying to figure out, you know, how can we fit our passenger trains in with their freight trains without disrupting your business or anything to that sort. So this looks like a phased approach. When we say phased, we mean both phased operationally and physically, and as far as capital development. So we really want to focus on how can we implement passenger rail the most quickly and most efficiently. You know, how can we use existing infrastructure, existing rail to kind of develop a fuller network, and really kind of starting slow and building a culture of passenger rail and building that ridership. Talking with many of the other kind of passenger rail systems that we're kind of looking at intercity. Seattle to Portland is a great example. The front runner over in Utah is another good example. What we've learned from them really, and this is again, no surprise for transit planners, as I'm sure most of you guys have understood, is really kind of starting small, right? We don't want to be running empty trains. And so really kind of start small and build those habits and build those patterns of ridership. And then, you know, when the train gets full, then you add another car, then you add another train specifically. So really kind of building blocks. We're not not wasting funds or starting off a service that's way too high of a service level, and really kind of reducing the effectiveness of these trains. So again, kind of just building that culture. Looking ahead for the rest of this year and into next year, the Rail Commission received 2 different CRISI grants. CRISI is it's a grant program from the Federal Railroad Administration. One of those is a little more focused on the southern end of things for the Southwest Chief, looking at how can we run a through car service up to Pueblo and maybe even Colorado Springs. But then also for the Denver region north, we've got another CRISI grant the title is a Rail Simulation Modeling and Preliminary Service Development Planning. And this is really to kind of add a little more meat to the bones of the operations plan that we're already looking at. That's kind of a big chunk of that. And then additionally, working with the Class 1 railroads, with Union Pacific, with BNSF to figure out, again, is it possible and how could it be possible to kind of slide a couple of passenger rail trains onto their rails without interrupting their freight rail business or any of the other things that they have going on. So again, the goal there is to define viable system and really push us on the doorstep of issuing a notice of intent for a full-blown NEPA review. So we're going to, of course, continue to do program outreach and collaboration with both the public as well as some of the key stakeholders, RTD, BNSF, the Federal Railroad Administration, Amtrak, and really kind of continuing to build those relationships in goodwill, and as well as advance the project with their projects as well. That's kind of the programmatic approach. Senate Bill 238, which is in the process of going through the Capitol right now. I'm going to let Jim talk about that in just a minute. And again, looking at short and long-term funding, right? Both operationally and for capital projects, because we need both money in the near term to kind of push these early NEPA steps and environmental planning steps forward. But then on looking out towards the further horizon, we're going to have to pay for this train somehow. And so we're really trying to identify strategies for that and position ourselves appropriately for such a thing. With this, sorry, I've got the bar at the top. Yep. So this is kind of approaching our looking at the Northwest Rail. I'm sure several of you know this. RTD is again revisiting Northwest Rail over the coming years to kind of revisit some of maybe those outdated environmental plans, but also kind of look at how can we implement RTD's Northwest Rail alignment. We are also studying that same area, and it's really important to us that we don't do work that overlaps somebody else's work. RTD specifically, we want to be a complementary service to that, not a competitive service. So really trying to make sure that we're aligned in our vision and our operations plans. So, where they're similar, those two studies is again kind of improving mobility, providing modal choices, so it's beyond just a single occupancy vehicle option there. Looking at economic development around stations and how we can move residents and employees back and forth where they need to go. Really, how can we provide a reliable trip, no matter the time or weather, as it may be. And again, kind of focusing on those alignments. Again, the alignment and right of way is looking at that BNSF alignment going towards Boulder. And then, some of the bigger engineering and environmental contextual questions. So some of those questions, again, are, who's the operator? What does that look like? What kind of technology are we going to be using? What is this operations plan? What does the schedule even look like? Where are stations going to be? How are we going to provide maintenance to these, to the rolling stock? Really trying to push forward those conversations together, so that, again, not doing anything that the right hand can't see, right? So we stay as coordinated and collaborative as possible. Again, framework for advancing next steps. This is how we're thinking about it. There's kind of the policy questions, the program questions, and then the very specific project questions. So on the policy side, looking at how we can move the Rail Commission to that next step of an organization, which is going on right now. And again, also funding and finance, I'm sure you guys can imagine, is often at the top of these questions. Programmatically, looking at how we include front range passenger rail and some of the long range transportation planning documents with Dr. Cog or North Front Range NPO or PPHG or whoever that may be, as well as with state agencies like CDOT. And then project, of course, we have to put together a project. What does this train system look like? So we've knocked off that alternatives analysis, which really puts us in a good place to advance into a NEPA review, be that an environmental assessment or an EIS or a CADX or whatever it may be. We really want to do as much homework as we possibly can right now to kind of streamline that and make sure that we don't have any hiccups later on. So with that, that's all I have to provide for now. I'm going to turn it over to Jim so we can talk a a little bit about Senate Bill 238, which is again the creation of a front range passenger rail district versus the commission.
Jim, you're on mute.
There we go.
Yeah, thanks. This legislation was first introduced last year and then COVID struck. So of course it was rolled over to this year. About a month and a half ago in the Senate Bill 238 was introduced. Create a front range rail district is the bill title. It was introduced with bipartisan senior legislative sponsors. It delineates a district in which the railroad would be built and operate. It authorizes a board of directors and directs how they would be appointed. It provides powers to that board and to any contractors it might select to run the railroad. And then it provides for oversight of the operation. There are 23 members of the board, of which 17 vote. Of those 17, 10 come from metropolitan planning organizations or councils of government up and down the Front Range. Up to six are non-voting. These include the Class 1 railroads and RTD and some of the other folks. They're non-voting because they may well end up receiving funding to operate trains and things like that. So we also have a voting member from the Department of Transportation, the Colorado Department of Transportation, and the governor appoints 6 board members. They are part of that 17 voting group, and one must represent environmental considerations and one must represent organized labor considerations. Since the bill was introduced, there have been 9 amendments. First of all, let me run you through. This is the corridor as described in the legislation. It includes what we might call the market areas that this service will serve. These would be the metropolitan planning organizations. You can see how they're laid out, principally from Fort Collins, North Front Range, all the way down through the Pueblo Council of Governments, and then and of course, including Colorado Springs. Above and beneath to the north and to the south of the MPOs, the corridor is a 10-mile wide corridor which surrounds the I-25 corridor. And that's essentially the service area. So you see, we've essentially delineated the Front Range system. And essentially, that's where we stand. The amendments changed the representation. We originally had, in the original legislation, had geographic representation. That did not satisfy Dr. Cog, Boulder, and others who wanted more voting representation, recognizing that their populations would be asked to pay more of any revenue that was raised from state taxation. The big powers, I think, are on the next slide. This district will have the authority to levy a sales and use tax subject to voter approval, as we would imagine here in Colorado. It also may create station area improvement districts in order to build stations and in order to generate revenue from businesses that may locate there. That has to be done with the approval of the property owner. It can enter into public-private partnerships. That's always on our mind. Is there some way to find private financing for this system? And obviously it has a whole array of additional powers. They're kind of indicated here in the 4th bullet, to employ its own personnel and contract for services and contract for construction and what have you. We looked at 7 different states to figure out what powers ought to be, including, I might add, RTD, and what powers ought to be given to this authority. And that's where that information came from. So it's a very powerful organization. It can deliver what we've been asked to do by the legislature. So with that, Joel, I'd just turn it over to questions because we could get buried in this quite easily in the details.
Especially with all those amendments that are happening even as we speak.
The big amendment was, again, representation, as you would imagine. We added some voting representation to the most populous districts. We did keep representation from some of the small communities way to the south simply because they're a part of the corridor.
Our first question will be from Mike Hughes. Mike lives in an East Denver neighborhood, but also represents the West Side TMA. Mike?
Joel, thanks. My question is, if the final alignment takes Front Range passenger rail to the same place that RTD operates today, so the Southwest corridor was one that looks like it's like it lines up, and there are others. Do you imagine the possibility that RTD would transfer assets to Front Range passenger rail?
That could be on the table. We have drafted and have shared and are now reviewing and preparing to approve a memorandum of understanding with the commission, with CDOT, and with RTD. DRCOG is asked to have input into that, as you might imagine, because they have oversight for planning for RTD. And so those groups will be at the table. One provision in there that has not been disputed or rejected by anybody and is on the table is sharing costs, sharing equipment, sharing operations. We've discussed sharing a maintenance center. We've discussed the possibility of having similar technology in the Northwest alignment and all the way from Fort Collins on down. These things make great sense, at least to me, as one of the political commissioners. It just seems like this would be a smart thing to do. And the best way to utilize the money that's already been raised under FAST Act funding, or the 2004 ballot measure, and apply that to resolving this problem that unfortunately RTD had getting the Northwest alignment completed. So I hope I'm answering the question. I'll leave it at that.
No, it makes sense to me too. I appreciate the answer.
Thank
And among those partners, Jim, you didn't mention Amtrak, but I imagine Amtrak with its special powers and the very, very positive things the head of Amtrak has said about this corridor, they would be closely involved, yes?
Yeah, very much so. And Amtrak's one of the non-voting members, as you might imagine. They serve on our current commission, and they've been involved throughout. As a matter of fact, over the last month, we've had 2 extraordinarily valuable meetings with Amtrak, BNSF Railway, RTD, and the commission, and CDOT, to look at the technical questions we would face operating together, both operating on a freight right-of-way. By the way, one of the reasons the commission voted for the freight right-of-way, that was their preference, not a final decision, but a preference, was that Amtrak informed us that their normal way of operating, if they don't own the track, as they do in the Northeast Corridor, their normal way of operating is on a freight right-of-way under statutory provisions that they have in their organic legislation, US legislation. So, this all pushed us in that direction to begin with. And then, of course, with the election of President Biden and his interest in rail, and with CDOT's new interest and Amtrak's interest in obtaining funding for new corridor development, they have their plans, if Congress approves them, include helping launch systems like ours. In other words, we all know this, the big hurdle for these large infrastructure projects is the front end cost. And the fact that you have to go to the taxpayers, get the bonding approved at a minimum, and get the taxes approved if you're under Tabor. So having Amtrak come in with that front end funding would be extremely valuable, and I think would make this a realistic system. I don't think Colorado voters are going to vote for this unless we get some federal support here to make sure that this thing's going to be followed through. Yeah. This leads us to the conclusion, although it's not yet been reached, but it's very likely Amtrak would be the operator too. They operate trains in California, very successful operations. But I hasten to add, the new district will have the authority to contract with Herzog or any other operator if they should choose to do so. And I might also add that 2 things have to happen before any federal money can be received, or before construction can be undertaken in some regards. And that is, we have to proceed through the NEPA process that Spencer mentioned, and we have to provide or develop and have approved the Federal Road Administration's requirement for a service development plan. And go ahead, Joel, I'm sorry.
Let me just try to get in a couple more questions before we call time, but this is important context you're providing. Thank you. Steve Harley has a question about the alignment in and near Denver.
Hi, folks. How's my audio?
Sounds good.
Okay. So I'm Steve Harley, and I'm in Baker, and one of my roles is to interpret this back to my neighbors. And we've been watching the Burnham Yard part of this very closely, but have been left in limbo because there's nothing definitive, except that it looks more likely now that CDOT will purchase Burnham Yard, but there's not a firm decision to move the rail line yet. And it's a very complicated question for us. I think we need to be involved early in order to sell this to neighbors. I know it's got the, it's the, hurt a few to benefit the many can win the day regardless, but there's a lot of different questions. Part of it is how close this will run to our residential area. Part of this is what the benefits might be that we get in return. And frankly, the Broadway station stop would be a benefit, I think, that could be sold. And then there's the fact that it's going to potentially wipe out a whole lot of businesses in Baker. And some of those are our favorite businesses in some ways. They're new businesses that have taken kind of revitalized little sections of the west side of Baker. So we need as much advance participation as possible in Baker. Also, there's a grade separation of the railway with Santa Fe and Calumet that is in the Valley Highway Plan. This would, of course, obviate it, but it would also delay it, the benefits of that, for who knows how many years. We've been waiting for that for 15 years now. And then it also, it gets even more complicated because we're starting to see more development on the west side of Baker, very close to the tracks, and the pedestrian accessibility of those areas would be enhanced by what's in the Valley Highway Plan. But if we decide that those things aren't going to happen, instead we're going to wait another 10 or 15 years for bridges of rail lines to be built through Baker, then we wait another 10 or 15 years for the people who go into these new residential developments can even safely walk to the rest of the neighborhood. So please involve us as soon as possible. And if you have anything to share right now, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I don't have a lot to share. I think the acquisition of Burnham Yard is moving very close to fruition. I think it's a good idea for the state. The Governor's Office of Economic Development is deeply involved. They've pledged additional funding. Negotiations, as far as I know, are underway. So I think it's very close. Our interest has been, I have to admit, has been to get the passenger rail capacity increased on the CML running down through Burnham Yard. At one time, we looked at it as a possible station there, but of course, as Spencer pointed out, it made more sense to put it at the I-25 and Broadway, very nearby. And we also had looked at the possibility of maintenance facilities being there. Of course, that's what the Rio Grande and the Union Pacific had used it for. But RTD has pretty much convinced us. None of these are final decisions, Joel, and to all the people listening. And so I have to be careful about this, but I guess I can say from our research, we're leaning toward these conclusions. And it looks to me like the Burnham Yard is the most important thing about the Burnham Yard, and the UP lead that comes into the Burnham Yard area is the fact that we can expand rail capacity and then therefore have through trains, or trains just up and do a turn into Denver Union Station. But we can increase the rail capacity so we don't inhibit any freight shipments, which, by the way, is not allowed under Amtrak's standing. And the railroads won't have it if Amtrak's not a part of this operation. Now, as far as the other questions you said, we are aware that BNSF has told us there are some businesses that might, to expand any of this right away, should we need to. There may be, I think, 3 possible businesses. Their understanding is those businesses would be happy to take the money and move. Now, don't quote me on that. I don't work for the railroad, but I just know that, they're very conscious of their right of way and the safety of their right of way, and what the requirements might be for their own operations. So, and so far we have a
Frankly,
really good relationship.
They might be thinking of businesses north of 6th Avenue and not in our neighborhood. They might not be
I think
thinking
so.
of the extension that they'll have to do down to the south of the yard, but go ahead.
Well, no. I mean, I'm going to turn over to Spencer if he has more to add. I don't know any more details about what's happening down there, other than we did meet with the preliminary environmental linkages people, but that was about a year ago. And so I don't recall these specific issues coming up. It was and I also run an advocacy organization here in Denver, and we've sat on the PEL advisory group. And as soon as this is over, I'd like to get your name in there. I guess I can get in touch with you through Joel, but I'll talk to our representative and see to what extent these other issues and questions have been addressed. Because as you might imagine, our job is the legislature directed us to facilitate the development of this line. So one thing we want to do whenever possible is identify any problems. That's what this front end business is all about. Resolve any we can, or at least provide this information to the new district board. And I didn't give you a timeline, but as it stands now, that new board would meet May 1st, 2022. And that board would replace the commission that I now chair. But Joel, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, we've reached the end of our time here. Maybe I just sneak in one that came in from Miles. Spencer, you mentioned the speed that these might operate at. This isn't considered high-speed rail, and probably wouldn't be thought of, possible to be high-speed rail in a shared corridor. Is that right?
That's right. So the term high-speed rail is a little bit ambiguous. Some people consider high-speed rail to be 250 miles an hour. I personally think 150-mile-an-hour train is high-speed rail. And so, looking at where we're going as far as alignments go with the freight rail alignments, they are pretty particular about, of course, with safety concerns is their biggest issue here. And so the footprint we need for those 220, 250-mile-an-hour trains doesn't really lend itself, unfortunately, to these freight rail alignments. And so what we're really focusing on is just making sure that we can be competitive or more competitive with single occupancy vehicle travel times. And again, looking at 180-mile-an-hour or 180-mile corridor, trying to hit 9 different stops, having a system that goes 220, 240 miles an hour becomes a little bit difficult. As soon as you get top speed, you're going to have to immediately break back down. And so really trying to balance cost efficiency with those travel times. And so high-speed rail, specifically right where the freight rail alignments are, is not currently something that we're looking at, but it's not something we want to preclude either.
If you could repeat what you said earlier about what the speeds might be in this concept.
About 90 to 110 miles an hour within the freight rail right of ways is what they're comfortable with.
Yeah. So I think us lay people would say that's not too bad.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. This has been again a delightful departure and broadening our minds. We all need to think more regionally. So really, really appreciate it. We reached the end of our meeting for May. In the next 2 days, we'll have the YouTube video up of this entire session up on the Interneighborhood Cooperation YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please tell your friends that if you want to geek out on transportation topics every other month, INC Transportation Committee is here and open to all. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.